Okay, I see you. Me?
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Shiv.
Yeah, perfect. Do you think you could close the shade in the back? It's really bright.
Yeah. How about that?
Oh, perfect. That's great.
Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
Good.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for making this up. This is terrific.
Good. Okay. Great.
Okay, all right. So we'll give you a few minutes then. You're already on online on MLK.
Okay, and with the whole global classroom?
Yeah, with the whole global classroom.
Good.
Yeah.
So, Shiv, why don't you do a couple of minutes of, or a minute or two of introduction, and then I'm ready to start.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Right.
I want my own. Shiv, I'm not hearing you.
Is the final class of the Foundations on Sustainable Development of the MDP network. I'm really happy to have Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs waiting online. He's actually at the Vatican, and he's going to be coming in through Google Hangout. And before we hand it over to him, just wanted you, all of you, to kind of step back and just think about where we've been over the last 13 plus weeks. How kind of humanity has moved all the way from just starting out with the formal process of 1972, the Stockholm Environment Conference, through 1992 to many of the other important kind of UN events, signing of declarations, desertification, biodiversity convention, climate change, and now we are at the cusp of a landmark, potentially landmark agreement on sustainable development goals. And next year, as Professor Sachs has emphasized, going to be three extremely important events: financing for development, climate change, the COP21 in Paris, and for the SDGs in September of 2015. Later this week, we're going to have the UN Secretary General release the synthesis report that's going to set potentially the framework for countries to discuss internally and come together as one to adopt sustainable development goals in September of next year. So what we'd really like to do is, in this class, for all of you, to kind of think through how far we have come. And of course, we have ways to go, but how far humanity has come. And I'd like to welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs for this final address. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much, and to your work. I'm actually at the Vatican today for a quite wonderful event. Pope Francis invited religious leaders of all faiths, Patriarch Bartholomew, religious leaders of the Shia and faiths, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chief Rabbi of Buenos Aires, and other leaders who joined together in a statement and against human trafficking and models of human slavery, which we sometimes think is eradicated from the planet to more than a century, but in fact, tens of millions of people are subject to labor and to human trafficking of various kinds. And so Pope Francis summoned world religious leaders today, and they adopted a joint pledge to work together across space for the purpose of ending human trafficking and all forms of modern slavery within the next few years. It's quite inspiring to see this, and also, I think, quite inspiring for all our purposes of sustainable development. The idea that across the major base of the world, it's possible to get cooperation, a pledge to common action, and some specific ideas about how to forward to actually realize this big dream. This is what the world will try to do on fronts in 2015. And I know that Pope Francis is going to continue in this direction of working together with leaders on the sustainable development objectives that are so important for the world and have been at the core of our discussion. As Professor so much more just noted, and as we've been talking about all semester, the coming year is a remarkable one from the point of view of global diplomacy. Because if it works that these three big summits on finance in July, on adopting the Sustainable Development Goals next September, and on finding an agreement on climate change 1 year from now in Paris in 2015 actually succeed, then 2015 will be the year in which we could say the world changes directions towards sustainable development. And I hope you're pleased that you will be well trained to help guide that process in the years ahead. So I'm very happy to adopt successfully the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are able to a good understanding at all three of these summits. I'd like to bring on the diplomatic process that is occurring right now and show you some of the challenges so that we can see how much of what we have been discussing really hangs in the balance in the coming 12 months. And reasons why we should be optimistic that we can find a way through. When it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, the commitment to have SDGs was adopted back in 2012, and the date for adopting the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, is September 2015. We're into the home stretch of these negotiations. A committee of the UN General Assembly, including almost 90 countries, called the Open Working Group, made recommendations as of this past summer on 17 headline areas for the SDGs. And those 17 include ending extreme poverty, ensuring universal access to basic health care, universal access to education, at least through the secondary level, protection of the oceans and marine ecosystems, protection of the terrestrial, land-based ecosystems, fighting climate change, resilient cities, ending hunger and undernutrition, and good governance, including rule of law and an observance of human rights, as well as a final goal, what is proposed as Goal 17, which is a global partnership to achieve these sustainable development goals. Now, those proposals will be taken by the member states, the 193 member states in the UN, and under the guidance of two governments that are called the co-facilitators, and in this case it's the governments of Kenya and Ireland. The 193 governments will negotiate a final outcome, and that final outcome will include a final statement of the sustainable goals. I personally am hoping that from 17 headlines that are there right now, the governments will agree to reduce the number of goals by redrafting them in a way to be more concise and getting the list down to perhaps 10 to 12 goals in the end. But these will be our guideposts, and they will embrace, as I described, the three pillars of sustainable development: the economic dimension, the social inclusion, reducing inequality and gender discrimination, and the environmental sustainability dimension, all underpinned by good governance and global partnership. I think we're going to get there to a good outcome. But what interests the governments, naturally, is what they call the means of the implementation, or MOI. What if we have goals? What if we have 12 strong sustainable development goals that will cover the period 2015 to 2030? What happens then? How will these goals be implemented? And by means of implementation, the member states of the UN include several elements. One is financial support for poor countries to achieve the goals, development assistance. Second is improving the financial markets so that they will channel funds towards low-carbon energy, for example, and away from the high-carbon energy producers. Third is making sure that the international trading system works effectively. Fourth is making sure that the abuses in the international system right now, such as tax havens, secrecy havens, capital flight, are brought under control, at least to an important extent, so that countries in the world economy have a chance to actually implement effectively. And hold on for one moment, because I have to plug in the computer, because I'm about to lose all the power if I don't do so. Wait one moment. Finally, as means of implementation, how these goals will be measured, monitored, and how governments will be held accountable to achieve the goals. So all of that is to be decided in a year, basically the coming September. The number of goals, targets, and indicators that go along with the goals, so maybe 12 goals, 60 targets, 100 indicators, something like that, plus the accompanying means of implementation: financial, trade, regulation, data, monitoring systems, accountability. Now, what kind of accountability can there be for global goals? We don't have a global sheriff. We can't force governments to do things that they're not ready to do. But we can shine a spotlight on who is making progress and who's not making progress, which governments are implementing sustainable development goals, which ones are ignoring them. And the idea is that there should be an annual review by the key ministers of government around the world, such as finance, foreign the foreign ministers, development ministers, and that every 4 years probably there will be a global summit that would involve heads of state to take stock of the progress or lack of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's next September. We have 9 months to complete this work. It's moving in the right direction. But before we get to September, we have a very important meeting on money, on financing for development. That will be in Addis Ababa, July 12 to 15. And at that meeting, the governments of the world are supposed to agree on how the development aid will flow, how much money, which countries should be donor countries, which countries should be eligible to receive foreign assistance, how a new system to finance climate change control can be implemented. For example, part of the climate control effort, the governments have agreed to establish a new Green Climate Fund, or GCF. This Green Climate Fund is supposed to channel money to countries to help them adopt renewable energy, for example, move away from dirty coal-based energy. But that Green Climate Fund needs to raise funds. It needs to have the financial means in order to give real support to the low-income countries. What are the rules going to be for governing that Green Climate Fund? How much money each year should it disperse? Who is going to be providing that money? Those are all the issues of climate finance that need to be agreed in Addis Ababa next July. And if agreements are found, that will smooth the way for the Sustainable Development Goal meeting just 2 months later. We'll go from July in Ethiopia to the SDGs summit at the UN headquarters in New York in September. But if the governments can't agree on the financing, it could become a major barrier even to the SDGs. Therefore, the success of the of the summit in July is a very big deal. One of the most interesting aspects of these financial questions is the changing relationship among countries financially. For a long time, there was a relatively stable group of donor countries, mainly Western European countries, United States, Canada, and Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. They were the donor countries that gave development aid to the low-income countries. Now, of course, because of the emerging economies like China becoming wealthier, now the list of donor countries is certainly becoming one of the world's most important and most generous donor countries. So too are other middle-income countries becoming poorer countries. And Korea, which was a middle-income country and is now a high-income country, is also becoming a significant donor country. So another part of the summit next July will be to try to find a way to expand the club, if I could put it that way, of the donor countries to include China, Malaysia, Turkey, Brazil, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Countries that until recently were not necessarily large donor countries, but suddenly become key players in helping to finance sustainable development in low-income countries. And because these new governments are coming to the fore, they also want their share of setting the rules of the game globally. China is saying if we're going to put more money into the international system, we need a bigger vote. We need a bigger say. So another part of the discussion in July will be how to expand the number of countries that are part of the aid process and how to have a more fair governance system for development aid. But remember, as I said, in July next year, both official development aid, that is government-to-government financing, and private sector financing, capital markets investing in low-income and middle-income countries, both of those will be on the agenda. Now, let's suppose we reach agreement financially in July. We reach agreement in September on the Sustainable Development Goals. The year is not done because, as you know well by now, in December, just about exactly 1 year from today, the world will meet at COP21, the 21st Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to try to hammer out a sound agreement on climate. This, too, is going to be one of the hardest things to accomplish because the difficulty of reaching global agreements that treat countries in one sense with shared responsibility, but in another sense to recognize the differentiated responsibilities because of the different development levels of countries, has proven to be a very, very difficult challenge. In the world know that we should stop climate change. But the poor countries say, well, let the rich countries take responsibility. Rich countries say, let middle-income countries take responsibility. The coal and oil and gas importing countries say, let the fossil fuel exporters take responsibility. The fossil fuel exporting countries like Canada or Australia or the United States, for that matter, or Russia or the Gulf countries say it's not our fault. Let the using countries take responsibility. So the huge fight is over, first, what to do, and then second, how to do it, and third, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to have the main responsibilities to actually take the actions? Now, in terms of what to do, I'm hoping that a year from now, the agreement is that the what is that the countries will agree to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to honor the commitment to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial average temperature of the planet. In other words, Earth should warm by less than 2 degrees Celsius in order to stay relatively safe. The scientists say even 2 degrees Celsius warming, and we're halfway there now, we're at about 1 degree or about 0.91 degree, there's going to be a lot of instability. But if we go beyond 2 degrees, it will get very, very serious indeed. So in terms of the what to do, I hope that the governments agree to honor their long-standing promise to take actions to keep the warming to less than 2 degrees C. In terms of how to do that, as we've talked about in the course, the main issue is to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide from the use of fossil fuel. And to succeed in that, remember, really there are 3 big things to do. One is much greater efficiency of energy use. A second is a move to produce electricity with low carbon sources like wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, nuclear power, and carbon capture and sequestration, as opposed to high carbon sources like coal, oil, and gas. So that's the second part of the how to do. And then the third question is who's going to pay for this? What responsibilities? And the main point that I would emphasize is that unless all countries have the idea that by the middle of this century, they will have implemented a low-carbon energy system in their country, unless all parts of the world sign on, we won't make it. So this is a shared responsibility. That's why it's very exciting that the United States and China recently signed an agreement when President Obama and President Xi Jinping issued a joint statement saying the United States and China would abide by a climate agreement. Of course, the European Union, even weeks before that, had said that they would take very strong actions to reduce their emissions. So the name of the game, in my view, is a global agreement which says in the short term, different countries will take different actions, what are called the nationally determined contributions up to the year 2025 and 2030, but that all countries will commit to deep decarbonization that is really a movement away from fossil fuels by the middle of the 21st century. Finally, who to pay? And that comes back to the climate finance. That requires that high-income countries put real cash available to poor countries for three big purposes. One is to help the poor countries adopt low carbon energy. A second is to help the low-income countries to become more climate resilient, called climate adaptation. And the third is to help create an insurance system against losses and damages from climate disasters. And that whole package of financing, the so-called climate finance package, should be agreed in Addis Ababa, so that by the time the world arrives in Paris for these final negotiations in December 2015, some of the heavy issues, especially how to share the financial costs of all of this, will already have been decided. Now, if we just step back and take a final look, I think it's fair to say we have an incredibly big, complicated, and exciting agenda ahead, where if we can successfully reach agreements in goodwill and good science on financing for development, on sustainable development goals, and on a climate change agreement, by the end of next year, we should be able to say that the world is now at least pointed in a new direction, pointed toward sustainable development. But then we're going to say, what do we do next? How do we achieve these sustainable development goals? How do we use financing tools that have been agreed upon? And that's where you will come in. You have been studying all semester the key concepts of development. You've been reading the key documents. You've been examining key treaties. You've been reading the international reports. I hope that all of you find a fulfilling way to play a major role in the years ahead. As you know, I call this, of course, the age of sustainable development, because I hope very much that this is precisely the age that we're going to be living in, not an age of suffering, but an age when we can end poverty, an age when we can reduce the high inequalities that have emerged in our countries, and when we can finally get the danger of human-made change and human-made loss of biodiversity under effective, decent control. You will be skilled in finding those actions. You will be skilled in helping civil society business and government to move forward. And I hope you will play an active role in any one of your countries, in any one of your communities, whether you're in the business sector, the private sector, civil society sector, or government. There's an important role to play in the years ahead. I think it's fitting that I'll close now sending you the message from the Vatican, because, of course, it's inspiring for me to be here to see world religious agreeing on a very important concept of human freedom today to end in trafficking and modern slavery. But I think they will also agree on this agenda during 2015. I know that the religious leaders are discussing how they can contribute effectively to the new age of sustainable development to protect the earth and the people in it. It's central to the callings of all of the great faiths and all of the great secular philosophies of human well-being. And at the core of our challenge will be the shared values, the values that are what gives us the hope, the sense of purpose, and the commitment. You, I know, share those values. That's why you're taking this course. You have that commitment. I hope that this course has helped to develop skills for you. We will stay in contact. I hope many of you will go on to study these themes in tremendous depth in the practice or related programs. And the UN Development Solutions Network that I have the honor to direct for UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon will, I hope, also be able for you to engage effectively in whatever university, whatever part of the world you find yourself in. I hope that we are part of a network that we're working together with shared values, shared understanding to adopt sustainable development and actually implement and to achieve them in the coming generation. Let me close here and thank you very, very much for the chance to present this final lecture. And I'm going to turn back over to Jim. I myself am going to have to run to the airport from the back so that I can be back in New York for a conference tomorrow. And I want to thank you for being part of the course and take the occasion to wish all of you very happy holidays at the end of the year and a very happy, healthy New Year in 2015. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sachs. So I'll take over from here, and please safe travels, and we'll see you back in New York. So we do have some questions really primarily meant for Professor Sachs. So what I'll do is I'll try to answer the ones that I have some qualification. MDG dedicated to maternal mortality. Sorry, Amelia. Let's try to have this answered by Professor Sachs over Google Hangout in the coming weeks. So we'll make sure of that. Some of the ones really focused on MDGs. It'll be really good for Jeff to answer. And the second one is, I like that the SDGs are targeted towards addressing the problems of all nations, accountability structures. Okay, yeah, this is, I think he did mention, Professor Sachs, that it's not just the what of sustainable development with the SDGs, but also the how. And the how includes not only the financing, but also issues of accountability. And accountability starts with a couple of things. One is a metric, where you have a clear metric on what is it you're holding countries accountable to. So remember, the parties to the SDGs are nation states, or countries. I'm sure for many of you who are all development practitioners from different parts of the world, accountability means something quite different. It actually is, how do citizens hold governments accountable to? So here we need to make a distinction between what the UN processes deliver, which is accountability of nation states, of countries, to what they have promised, and Further down is the important aspect of development is how do you hold these countries, these governments itself responsible so that the citizens are can actually insist on what has been the promise. So what the UN system does is potentially come up with a metric for the nation states. Then it's for countries to begin to kind of adopt that and then further devolve that into kind of civil society. So that's an important part that also needs to be addressed in the coming months and around the time SDGs are adopted formally. So that is an important one. And Professor Sachs also emphasized not only the metric and how you need to have the ministers of finance, development, foreign affairs come together annually, basically a stock taking and to hold themselves responsible, not so much finger pointing, but hold themselves responsible. But you also have once in 4 years heads of state. So this is a place where heads of state really are kind of on the spotlight to not just on their own SDGs commitments and how far they have come along, but also the international promises they've made, for example, for financing. Because as we have seen in previous classes, it's one thing to pledge, but it's quite another thing to actually kind of deliver the money, the commitment. Okay, so that's an important one. And so there are some processes being put in place to make sure that you do have accountability coming in, and it's not just kind of promises. Okay, so now select. What if we do not get as much ODA for the SDGs received MDGs? That's a tough one. That's an open-ended one. That's always the problem is what happens if you have a very ambitious agenda, but you just don't have the financing. But really, financing has kind of two aspects. And again, we've discussed some of this in class before. You have the international kind of financial structure delivering on the promises of the member states. But again, I would like to repeat that for the largest financiers, the largest donors of development are the nation states themselves, the countries. They may be LDCs, they may be small island development states, most vulnerable countries. But if you examine the budget, with some serious exceptions, most countries themselves are their own biggest donors. So again, this is a case where you have the citizens of their countries to hold accountable their governments. And it is important. That should not obfuscate the importance of international finance, which is what we are kind of really, Professor Sachs was insisting, that really you need to hold the OECD countries, the industrialized countries, really responsible for the commitments they're going to make. Okay. I like the fact of done. That has an air of finality to it. Never to see daylight again. Okay, this we have done. Wow. Okay, great, terrific. Done. Okay. Could you respond to some of the criticism of the SDGs, the top-down nature? What kind of actions are taken to incorporate? Okay, yeah. So this is, unlike the MDGs, which many have observed, criticized as being top-down technocratic, because it's kind of in some sense foisted on the nation states, SDGs have taken a different path. So I would kind of partially disagree that you do have the voices of all countries, all 193 countries now being able to kind of have come around the table and actually give voice to their concerns. What should be the nature of SDGs and whether it kind of makes sense or not, or what kind of targets and indicators you need to have. But again, I think that what Lauren is kind of asking is top-down in the sense, not just satisfied with what governments are discussing, but also what about the citizens? What about communities? And this is something, again, where it's very difficult to hold the UN process responsible, because that, again, it's a coming together of sovereign nations. And if you remember, Mrs. Mary Robinson made a really, really, really good pointed remark that when people talk about sovereignty, they should be held accountable. It's not that the sovereignty of nation states, but actually sovereignty of citizens. So this is where this question is really good, that how do you make sure that the communities then hold accountable and give voice to what they would like done for sustainable development goals? And this is, again, where I think you have NGOs and the private sector play an important role in giving voice. So this again would be based on individual kind of what's done in each country, and it's not really a UN mandate. Okay. We're kind of coming close. I'll maybe take a couple of questions. Could you speak, I guess she's meaning, Elaine is meaning Professor Sachs, lessons learned from MDGs? Well, I think, Elaine, I think one of the things really, and we'll have Jeff address this more kind of fully. But a key thing was, as I mentioned, that MDGs was seen as kind of technocratic exercise done within the kind of the UN with some input from outside, but somehow the UN General Assembly was somehow not involved as deeply as in SDGs. The fact that you have an open working group with over 90 countries participating actively, I think is itself a distinct departure from what happened in the MDGs. And previously, if you remember, last year there was a high-level panel with 3 co-chairs, and they held extensive regional consultations. How many of you here or on the kind of network have participated in these high-level panel discussions? I know that, for example, in Latin America and South and Southeast Asia, there were a number of these panel discussions, and many universities kind of participated in them. So again, it's distinctly a different way of going about. And finally, with the release of the Secretary General's report this week, I think it's Thursday, 4th of December, you're going to have another formal process where you're going to have a process where chaired by 2 countries, co-chaired, Kenya and Ireland. They again going to kind of shepherd this process of having countries give voice to what should be the nature. And hopefully it should be a coming together and not a kind of just an intense negotiation, because then if you have a negotiation, then it may end up as kind of lowest common denominator. Nobody really wants that. So there is a distinct set of difference. And again, once MDGs were adopted, it took several years before actually then formalizing a structure to get going. Again, this is where, as Professor Sachs has discussed, we would really like to kind of cut short that and really have everything kind of lined up. The financing, not just the what to do, but the how to do it, the MOIs. So this, again, is a distinct departure from that. In terms of accountability, again, we are trying to set up a system in place so that you have baseline as you begin to kind of work towards. Okay, maybe the last one. How can we raise local awareness and participation towards SDGs? What are some strategies incorporate? Okay, I think this is where development practitioners have a big role to play. And mind you, SDGs formally are there for the next 15 to 20 years. So many of you on the MDP network would be a good part of your professional careers. You could look forward to working to kind of realize these SDGs. And that's kind of really exciting. Kind of exciting times you guys have selected, elected to be part of the MDP network. So again, in terms of raising local awareness, it's really absolutely important that practitioners of development have a role in raising local awareness. It's not just having these kind of workshops where you have kind of international delegates come and talk about SDGs. That's an important aspect, but you really have subnational to national discussions going on. And as part of SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we're kind of actually having a kind of a huge process where development of 2 handbooks on localizing SDGs. For example, it's really important for local policymakers to understand what's in it. What is it supposed to do with all these kind of amazing goals, all these kind of fantastic sounding goals? How do they kind of realize this? How do they kind of go about practicing it? And similarly for the private sector. The private sector cannot plead ignorance, saying, yeah, it's some intergovernmental process, we have nothing to do with it, because this time around, private sector has a huge role in terms of delivering of technologies, solutions, and again, a massive role for the NGO community. So what at SDSN we're planning to do in the rollout is to actually help in a very practical way to begin to kind of say, okay, what do countries need to do? What kind of inclusive processes do they need to put in place? At least at kind of 3 levels: at the national, at the provincial, state, subnational, and important, given high levels of urbanization in many countries, at the city levels. So how do city managers, how do they actually kind of begin to have a process to make sense of what these SDGs are and how to kind of make them kind of practice them in reality? So with that, I kind of sign off now. And thank you again for being part of this wonderful network. I thank Lucia, the one who's kind of kept us narrow and straight as part of the MDP network, and Professor Glenn Denning, who's here, who's the director of the program, and of course, all of you wonderful students, both here and overseas. Thank you. Goodbye.